Welcome to Everyday Economics, a weekly podcast about the economics in daily life. I'm your host, Puja Mehra. Even in the high growth years, the Indian economy does not generate a large enough number of well paid formal jobs to absorb the large number of low skilled Indians that can no longer subsist on shrinking farm plots. That's why it's called the jobless growth model. The migrant crisis is a direct consequence of the nature of India's workforce. The COVID crisis has blown the lid off this problem by bringing it out onto the roads where it could no longer be ignored. But even before the outbreak, workers were just about getting by. The imbalance of power between employers and employees is at the root of this problem. Because a vast pool of eager for work people is on the lookout for jobs at any given time, there's almost no bargaining power for labor. Replacements are easy to find, which in turn makes it easy for employers to hire and fire. If such a large section of the population does not earn well, it cannot spend well, then what happens to the promise of the market of aspirational Indians, the putative demographic dividend? It is hard to imagine if India is an economic superpower when 90% of the Indian workforce is in such deplorable condition. My guest today is Dr. Radhicka Kapoor, who works at ICRIER. Most of her research is in the area of poverty and inequality, labor economics, and industrial performance. I spoke to Radhicka to find out about the factors due to which the workforce has been systematically devalued over decades. Welcome to Everyday Economics, Radhicka.
Thank you, Puja.
I've had the benefit of so many informal conversations with you on India's labor and employment and unemployment problems, and I'm so glad to have you on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So we are recording this episode even as a grave labor crisis is unfolding. After struggling for weeks to return home, scores of distressed migrant laborers and their families, their little children, have returned to their villages in most cases. But this may just be the beginning of new challenges for them. It may not be the end of their troubles. The new challenges of few employment opportunities and therefore perhaps a collapse in wages. In this episode, I will ask you to explain, why there is such a large proportion of India's workforce that is so economically fragile, um, um, the failure of the economic growth model that has not improved prospects for such a large proportion of the workforce, even though for people who work in corporates, people who work in government, things have improved considerably after 1991. But before I get to that meat of this main question of this episode, I'd like you to explain what is India's labor market for workers look like? What are the different classes of workers? What is the hierarchy of workers in terms of the benefits and the protection that they receive? What is the difference in vulnerability and economic insecurity of different classes of workers, and how large are these different classes?
So, Pooja, India's labor market is characterized by what is called a dualistic structure, which essentially means that you have a very large proportion of the workforce employed in the unorganized sector, and a considerably smaller proportion of the workforce is in what is the organized sector. And even though it is the unorganized sector that accounts for a disproportionately large share of employment, its contribution to gross value added is lower than that of the organized sector. Now, in addition to the existence of this organized and unorganized sector, you have different types of employment arrangements or different types of employment status that exist in India. To begin with, about 75% of our workforce falls in the category of what is called self-employment or casual labor. Now, these are people who are essentially outside the edge of standard employer-employee relationship. They have no employment security, really, no income security in the sense that they don't have a steady flow of income. They typically have little or no social protection. And that's 75% of our workforce. And the remaining 25 falls in the category of regular wage salaried workers. So these are people who have a stable income. They have a steady source of income. But even for this class of workers, there is a reasonably high degree of vulnerability. Just to explain to you a little bit about this, you can examine the vulnerability of even regular wage salaried workers by looking at the kind of job contracts they have, or by looking at their access to social security benefits. And some of the recent household level data, which tells us about employment and unemployment in India, according to that, just about 40% of all regular wage salaried workers in India had access to one social security benefit. So that means just about 9% of India's total employment was in what can be called regular protected employment or regular formal jobs. So that basically tells you that there's a very small proportion of the workforce which has access to a steady flow of income and a basic level of social security. If you actually go down a bit further and you see that what is the percentage of regular wage salaried workers who had access to all possible social security benefits that are captured in our databases, be it Provident Fund, healthcare, and maternity benefits, that's just about 3.8% of the total workforce. And then if you look at those regular wage salaried workers who not only had access to, all social security benefits, but also had written contracts for a period of more than 3 years, that's just a little over 2% of the workforce. So imagine that you have a little over 2% of the workforce, which is actually in what can be called good, stable, secure jobs. That really gives you a sense of how vulnerable or precarious India's workforce is. And also, if you look at the level of earnings, you'll realize that typically most people are in very low wage jobs. For instance, even in the category of regular wage salaried workers, which are typically better off than the casual or the self-employed, what we find from the last employment unemployment survey that's available is that just about 36% of all regular wage salaried workers earn more than 15,000 rupees a month, and 45% actually earn below 9,750 rupees a month. And where am I coming up with this 9,750 number? There was actually an expert committee which was appointed by the government in 2018 to determine a minimum wage for India. And they said that the minimum wage amounted to 375 rupees a day, or 9,750 rupees a month. So you can imagine that if 45% of your regular wage salaried workers are also earning less than what is this minimum wage, then they must be extremely vulnerable. And casual workers are even more vulnerable because 94% of them earn less than rupees 375 a day. So imagine, I mean, casual workers are people who don't even get employment on a daily basis. So for them to earn the minimum threshold of in a month of 9,750 is even harder. The reason I'm throwing all these statistics at you is just to explain to you that not only are the terms of employment very precarious, but also the earning levels are so low that given the state that we are in right now, I mean, most of our workforce really doesn't have the financial wherewithal to cope with a period of unemployment or a lockdown.
And these numbers that you say, do they include government employees and public sector employees? The 2% of the most economically secure with all kinds of social protection that you spoke of?
Absolutely. So it's likely that most of these people are really what is counting for that 2% figure.
So even before the COVID crisis, workers were just about getting by, as you say. And I think this helps me put in perspective the fact that if the minimum wage per day, which was proposed, was 375 rupees, then the rupees 500 cash transfer per month for the next 3 months announced by the central government for Jan Dhan accounts of women is actually less than 2 days' wages. That,
Absolutely.
that's how
Of course,
small
it
the
will not
income
matter that this recommendation of 375 rupees was not
was
accepted.
not accepted. Yeah.
Yes.
So in this current situation, we've of course been watching the state's many failures, its incapacity to reach out to migrant laborers. In fact, in an interview to the Hindustan Times, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman accepted that the government has no administrative mechanism to deliver relief in a targeted way to informal workers who were being reported about in the press. And so the state failure is quite clear, but also the lid has been blown off the Indian growth model. If there is such a large proportion of the workforce that is so vulnerable, getting paid as little as you're saying, with no social benefits or protection, no retirement benefits, no formal leave, then what has really the growth model delivered to the large part of the population?
Well, it's interesting to look at this in the context of economic growth that India has witnessed, because some of the statistics that I was telling you, for example, the 2% that I was telling you about, which is in these really good, secure jobs, that number hasn't really fluctuated at all. Even if you go back to 2004-5, and the period after that is when India witnessed spectacular growth. That showed us is that despite the fact that we translate into creation of good jobs. In fact, that period in the literature is referred to as the period between 2012 and 2017-18. That period is now being referred to by some as lost growth, because we've actually seen a decline in employment in absolute terms during this period, despite having positive growth rates. And the disconnect between growth and employment essentially, to my mind, is a result of the sectoral composition of growth. It is a result of the nature of the structural transformation that we have undergone, where basically we have seen a leap straight from the agriculture to the services sector. And the phase of manufacturing-led growth, we have jumped that. So high growth of GDP was created, because of high-end services, but these were not the sectors that were actually able to generate employment for large numbers of India's unskilled, low-skilled, or semi-skilled workers. The sector that actually had the capability to do that, which is the manufacturing sector in particular, because there is no other country at India's level of development where growth has been service led and not manufacturing led, that phase never happened. So we really haven't been able to create those kind of jobs. And even within manufacturing, the sectors that have performed well are again the more capital intensive sectors, not the labor intensive sectors, which could have essentially absorbed the large masses of people which were exiting the agricultural sector. So the story of the sectoral composition of growth is critical to understanding why we first had job less growth, and then of course it moved to job loss growth during 2011-12 and 2017-18.
And why do you think, is this because of the spurt in the financial sector and the other sectors which need high skilled workers?
Well, yes, essentially those are, the high skilled sectors, the IT services, the financial sectors. That's where the growth in terms of value added has come from. But the employment in that sector is for all the high skilled workers. So there been that disconnect.
Right. And so let's talk now about the how fragile, this large proportion, more than 90% of the workforce is when they are on the negotiate. In fact, there is probably no negotiation when they sort of, have go looking for jobs. Uh, High skilled workers such as you and me, such as people who work in the financial sector, people who work in other sectors, service sectors, they have considerable bargaining power. If an investment banker wants to get a better pay, and unless the industry is in a downturn, they can just go get another job or negotiate with their existing employers for a better pay or for better conditions. But the large workforce that we are talking about, the informal workforce, is unable to do so because they're so easily replaceable. If they demand any improvement in working condition, there are five other people desperate to get that job, and the employer knows that. Uh, could you explain, how this low bargaining power plays out for this large part of the workforce?
So essentially, we're in a labor surplus economy. The pace of job creation, in particular in the formal sector, has not kept up with the pace at which the labor force has been increasing. So what's happened is that basically, if you're poor, if you have a low level of education, in a country where there is really no unemployment insurance, the cost of remaining unemployed for you is too high. As a result of it, you are compelled to do whatever comes your way, be it in terms of any sort of casual work, or you will create some kind of employment by becoming self employed. Because unemployment is really a luxury that the educated, well off can afford, not the large masses of low skilled and unskilled who are poor. So as a result of it, because they have to take pretty much anything that comes their way, and because the pace of job creation is not keeping up with that supply of labor, they are essentially left with very little or no bargaining power.
So they have no choice. And let's discuss what could be the various reasons for this low bargaining power sort of situation. There are many arguments that are given by people for this situation, such as greed of business owners, for instance. It is often thought of as business wanting to be exploitative and business wanting to become rich at the cost of labor, and therefore business paying them low wages. But as you said, this could be challenged by the fact that there is a the most profitable and the best performing part, in fact, of Indian industry is the high capital intensive industry, where business owners are choosing to not hire low cost labor, but instead go for a capitalistic production option, which is more expensive. And certainly, taking a loan, importing technology, buying capital, buying machinery and equipment is more expensive than hiring low cost labor, than providing all the various kinds of protection that your laws expect you to provide for labor. So would you say that the profit motive is primarily responsible, as many people do, for this situation that we are seeing?
So, when the conversation about labor surplus and bargaining power and profit, I mean, now let's turn to just the organized sector, because whatever you have said so far will apply to the organized sector, not to the unorganized or the informal sector. Now, it is true that the industries which have performed better in the organized manufacturing sector are more capital intensive industries. It is true also that average wages in the more capital intensive industries are higher than average wages in more labor intensive industries, what you were alluding to at this point. But if you look at the share of wages in gross value added in capital intensive industries, it's actually considerably lower than what it is in labor intensive industries. So for capital intensive industries, we're investing much more in capital and other modes of production as opposed to labor when you look at how that pool is divided between labor and capital. So they might be paying higher wages on average, but the share of wages in their gross value added is still very small. And if you look at the manufacturing sector as a whole also, you see that the share of wages in gross value added has in fact remained very has not increased. It's actually declined. It declined quite sharply between 2000 and 2008-9, and then it picked up a bit. But basically, it's remained below 15% of gross value added. So therefore, the share of wages across the board, it's not been increasing. It's not been a factor that could have really dented the profitability of business as it has been made out to be. But having said that, when you talk of capital intensive industries, it's important to also bear in mind that some of the most capital intensive industries in our manufacturing sector are the ones which have actually resorted to increasing contractualization of the workforce. And that contractualization they have done essentially because hiring these contract workers is much cheaper. They don't have to pay social security costs associated with them. So contract workers are performing the same tasks as their directly employed workers, but it's much cheaper. Also, having this contract workforce acts to their advantage because they can use it to suppress the bargaining power of their regular or unionized workers. So yes, to a large extent, it is driven by profits.
So I don't understand this. If wages in any case are a very small part of the costs, then
Hmm.
how would suppressing wages make a big difference to profitability?
Well, it's not just about so one part of it is of course profit. The other part also is that you have to look at it in terms of the labor regulatory architecture that is there. And there is a lot of the large firms have in fact resorted to contractualization also to circumvent labor regulations. But then there are so many other costs to business that they are essentially trying to suppress whatever they can because it has a low bargaining power, because that is a surplus, and that helps to enhance their profits.
Right. So,
Because if you're in a capital intensive industry and you have to incur much more on your machines, you would try to squeeze labor to the extent possible, also to become globally competitive.
even if your wages, the amount of your the amount that you're paying to wages has come down to, I think research shows 10% versus 30% in the 1980s. uh,
Right.
10% 10% of gross value added is very small. How much can you squeeze out of it?
Well,
What I'm
so
trying to
that's
say is, that it's not really going to make that big a difference to profitability, is it?
Well, yes, it is actually not going to make, and therefore the whole argument, therefore, that it is labor which is the binding factor that has hurt the growth of the manufacturing sector is in fact flawed, because already it is accounting for such a small share of your value added that to then pin the blame on it and say that that is what is holding back your growth is absurd.
Equally, to say that because you can save your profits, you can improve your profitability by exploiting labor in at least this
Hmm.
capital intensive part of the industry, that also seems like a weak argument. If you're paying just 10% of your gross value added to
Hmm.
labor, then
Hmm.
by squeezing it further, there isn't much scope for you to improve your profitability.
Absolutely. But you
So,
see, the reason why you have actually managed to squeeze their profitability over time is because you have also done things like contractualizing the workforce. The period that we are referring to, where we actually see this decline, is when you have resorted to increasing contractualization of the workforce. So you have workers who are doing the same kind of job as directly hired workers, but you're paying them lower wages, and also you don't have to incur any of the social security costs that are associated with having directly employed workers. So it's sort of a circular argument what you're saying. But yeah, what you're saying
got
is right.
got it. And I mean, I think the question is that, like the most vocal has been Rajiv Bajaj, who incidentally represents the extremely capital-intensive segment of Indian industry. And when he describes India's approach to labor regulations using very striking phrases such as India's demonstrating a pendulum swing of going from highly restrictive labor laws to complete suspension. And he also says that third-class labor laws cannot be expected to lead to the rise of first-class companies. The point is that why are more and more industrialists like him opting for capital-intensive industry rather than low-cost labor industry? Because that is where, since labor costs are so low, that is where you can make more profits, going by this argument of exploitability.
Well, labor is just one factor in that entire matrix of things which determines the choices which are made. There is also a hysteresis argument. There are industries that they have been in for a while, they have developed a comparative advantage. So the decision of which industry they are going to be in is determined by a whole gamut of factors. But yes, it is true that we are swinging from this pendulum, from one end of the pendulum to the other, as you're describing. But having said that, it's also important to remember that when we say that India has one of the most highly regulated labor regimes, a lot of this is simply on paper. De facto, there is in fact a lot of flexibility in the labor regime, and that is demonstrated by things like how there is such a high share of regular wage salaried workers who have no contracts, who have no access to social security, like I mentioned, or even the fact that wage growth in of directly employed workers in the manufacturing sector has actually remained very flat. Um, so there is, when we make that statement, we have to distinguish between what are things de facto and what they are de jure.
Exactly. And you're right. We don't have jobs or well-paying formal jobs. we don't have labor protection, we seem to be in a lose-lose situation. And all our energy gets spent in suspecting labor laws or suspecting labor law reforms, arguing about that. But the point is that none of the labor protection we have so far has done anything to help the labor, and there are not enough jobs getting created. And so, what do you suggest should be the way forward?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a real pity, but the sort of labor regulatory environment that is there, I mean, to my mind, it's neither serve the interests of labor nor of employers. And the kind of discourse that we have been having over this issue now for a while, where all the focus is on hire and fire, has actually, created a sort of lopsided narrative and in many ways deprived us of a real chance of reform. A lot of this debate has focused on one particular act, which is called Chapter 5B of the Industrial Disputes Act, which basically says that if a factory has to fire or lay off even one worker, it has to seek the permission of the state government in which it resides. And because of this, we've heard so much about how draconian India's labor laws are. But as I demonstrated to you through the various statistics that we've talked about, a very large proportion of India's workforce is still left completely unprotected, against any arbitrary actions of employers, or they don't have any social protection. And the conversation about the labor reform, therefore, has to be about how we can ensure all workers, regardless of the nature of the contract they have, a certain basic minimum level of social protection and a certain basic level of minimum wages. Until we actually have those safety nets, till we have that social security, we really won't be able to make any other meaningful reforms in terms of hire or fire.
Absolutely. And, I'd like to bring up here the example of Bangladesh. The Industrial Disputes Act that you just spoke of was common to India, and what is today Bangladesh and what is today Pakistan. And in India, while it continues to, as many economists say, impose heavy restrictions on firms, but Pakistan actually repealed it in 1958 in the part that later on went on to become Bangladesh. And today, India lags Bangladesh in the labor-intensive garments manufacturing sector. In fact, we've heard of many Indian garment manufacturers wanting to shift their production base to Bangladesh. And if such a thing happens, it'll only increase informalization, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are a couple of points in what you're saying. One is this example that we hear about our contrast with Bangladesh. I mean, we also have to factor in that because it's an LDC country, it enjoys so many duty incentives, and so
Tariff.
it becomes much more cheaper to produce from there. So it's not just the labor factor alone, which is responsible. Also, on so many human development indicators, Bangladesh, in fact, does much better than India. And one lesson for us to learn from that is that just because we have a large labor force doesn't mean that it's a productive labor force. We actually have to invest in its education and turn that labor surplus into a comparative or a competitive advantage for ourselves. And clearly, we haven't done that because even for labor intensive activities, you need some basic level of industrial literacy. But going back to the Industrial Disputes Act, yes, absolutely. I mean, what we have ended up doing is that we have given a very high degree of protection to a minuscule proportion of the workforce while leaving a very large proportion of our workforce completely unprotected. And that, in fact, has created this perception that we have very rigid labor laws. And so we actually have a dualism even in the labor regulatory regime. And that is what we have to try and do away with to ensure that all workers have that basic minimum protection and move
I
towards,
agree.
a universal social protection floor.
I agree. And, especially when we read newspaper reports of, for instance, just last month, Tech Mahindra, a company like Tech Mahindra in Pune, receiving a notice from the Labor Department because they reduced salaries in the current market situation, in the COVID pandemic situation. They reduced salaries because they're not allowed to operate. If a company is not allowed to make adjustments to market conditions in its wage costs, then such a labor regulation environment is actually pushing companies into insolvency. How does it help
Well,
anybody?
well, what has happened currently has to be looked in a completely different context from anything so far, because this is really an unprecedented shock. and it's completely exogenous. And obviously, there was the lockdown has been a was a period when there was a complete cessation of economic activity. So that was exceptional. And, in that, the government to begin with had even issued this advisory that firms have to pay their workers for the entire period of the lockdown, which is really difficult to do given that we were already grappling with a difficult economic situation. And of course, the government then had to go back, and that was challenged in the court. And the court said that the firms didn't actually have to follow that advisory. And ironically, while the government is advising people to do this, it itself, being the employer in a public welfare program like Narega, was not paying unemployment allowance to to workers with job cards, when it is in fact their employer, and the same principle should have been applied to the government. So this situation is truly an exceptional one, and but what it has highlighted is the high degree of precarity, and therefore the fact that you need social protection for all workers.
And the signal that it sends out, when you're trying to reach out to investors sitting on cash, and when you're trying to tell them that, we want you to invest, and we want the economy to grow, and we want to quickly come out of this, the impact of COVID. And at the same time, if you're sharing headlines with, a fairly well reputed company getting a labor department notice, that's not the signal you want to send out.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the fact is that while the government did announce this wage support scheme, I mean, where the government would pay the EPF contribution, which is 24% of wages, of workers to support MSMEs, there has been no support for large enterprises. And if the idea is, in fact, to protect low wage formal workers, most of India's low wage formal workers are actually in large enterprises. They are in enterprises which have 100 or more workers. So there has to be some kind of wage support given to these large enterprises also, given that this is a truly exceptional situation. I mean, how you design that wage support for a large enterprise could be different from an MSME, factoring in moral hazard issues. But the government at this point should have been more sympathetic, I think, to the plight of enterprises, because at the end of it, if these enterprises are not going to survive, be it the small or the large, even though the large have greater financial wherewithal to cope with this, there will be no jobs at the end of it.
Yeah, you're right. They're almost rationing support and relief, and it's sort of again another example of how the state just doesn't understand issues, and then typically comes up with solutions which are unfair and full of gaps. Uh, to, Towards the end of this episode, I want to also discuss a little and get your thoughts on, the whole demographic angle to all of this. It's not an accident that low-wage jobs are more likely to be held by people from 4 or 5 states: Bihar, UP, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand. It is the people of these states who have no employment opportunities in their native states, and therefore they are far more vulnerable because of their lack of choice and their economic insecurity. And they have often no option but to show up for these exploitative jobs in other states and other cities. Uh, Probably one of the best solutions would be for more job opportunities to come up in these particular states. Do you think the migrant labor will return as is being expected? Will they return in the same numbers once the lockdowns end? Or do you think states like Uttar Pradesh and Bihar will be forced to do something finally about the low employment generation in these states?
Well, so it's hard to predict whether the migrant labor is going to come back or not, and when it's going to come back, given the conditions under which they've left. But of course, I'm sure some of them will come back. But the larger issue that you raise is a pertinent one, because if you go back and look at the pattern of regional development of India, and you can go back to the 1960s, basically the regional growth performance has been very polarized. You've had this high income club of states, like Gujarat, Maharashtra, Punjab, Haryana, Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and you've got the low income club, which is, Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh. And that polarization has continued over time. And you also see, when you look at the patterns of migration, it's basically going from these low income club states to the high income club states, because the low income club states are really the ones who haven't been able to create gainful employment opportunities for people who live in those states. And as a result of it, these people have been pushed to go and work in other states, typically in precarious jobs, in low paying jobs, because they don't have an alternative. So while some migrants will come back, but I think this is an important time for us to sit back and reflect, actually not sit back, act on this uneven pattern of regional development, and go back to perhaps the conversation we had in the 60s and the 70s about location-based industrial policies, so that we can ensure a more balanced regional development. I mean, for example, Ratin Roy always gives this example where he says that if you looked at apparel, just simply producing shirts, if you located the industries which produce this in states like Bihar and Jharkhand and various other states, where actually labor is much cheaper, and it has actually acquired some level of skill also because it's been migrating to other states and working, you could exploit that to your advantage. So I definitely think the two key learnings from the migrant labor crisis, I mean, one is social protection for all, and the second is we need to think of location-based industrial policies and regional, a more balanced part of regional development.
Yeah, and these states, I think, should stop acting, or I mean, it's not like it's a choice they make, but they have ended up acting as an unlimited source of cheap and easily replaceable labor for other states, for industry in other states, and probably it's about time they rethink their own economic policies and think why industry is not coming up in these states, and like you say, what can be done for a more locational focus to industrial development going forward, and of course the focus away from services to manufacturing, which can only generate large number of jobs, as you say. Before I end the episode, Radhika, please could you share a few reading recommendations for listeners who are interested in learning more about all the various things that you have talked about?
So let me recommend two books actually, both of whom are by the same author, but I think they give you a very good understanding of the labor market in terms of a very balanced perspective of both the organized and the unorganized sector. One is the India Employment Report of 2016 by Ajit Ghosh, and he has more recently written another book which is called Employment in India, and it's a series of it's a part of a series of short books that Oxford has come up with to understand the Indian economy. So I would recommend these two books to get a very comprehensive perspective of India's labor markets.
Thank you, Radhika. Thank you so much.
Thank you.